Good evening, friends, and shalom, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. Want to say a quick shalom to iQuicks and None Your Biz, who have made yourselves known in the live chat. Shalom to you both. Thank you very much for being here. Going to have a fun episode today, but before we do that, of course, I want to get into some of our channel housekeeping, so let me go ahead and do that. First things first, I want to remind you guys of what we have scheduled this week, as well as just this month so far. So we're planning on having a video up every day for the first week of August. Yesterday, we were doing a video on Shavuot, which is, I think, a very excellent video if you're interested in checking it out. Today, we'll be doing the part 3 response to Dr. Falk and Inspiring Philosophy on the late date Exodus and their answers to some early date objections, specifically Dr. Falk's answers to some early date objections. Tomorrow, we're going to be having our first episode of a new series I'm calling Breakfast Tea, which will be video essays, kind of blog style, having a pre-written quote unquote blog post, something like 1,500 to 2,500 words, and then just kind of recording it up on here, kind of the same way as like Blog and Mablog, if you guys are interested or familiar with that kind of stuff, right? Although, even though it's supposed to be in the morning, tomorrow's likely will not be because, first time trying to get everything up, it's a little bit difficult. Anyways, on the 4th, August 4th, that is this Thursday, we'll be having a conversation with T-Jump or Tom Jump on the question of ethics. He, of course, is an atheist, and I am, of course, a Christian, so we're going to be having, I think, a very interesting conversation there on ethics. Not a debate, just a discussion. The day after that, August the 5th, we'll be doing a review of a couple different times that I jumped into Vocab Malone's Smoke Room. And that's going to be very interesting. It's going to be discussing basically how Christians should view American history, especially things like the Confederacy. On the 6th, that is Saturday, we're hoping to get up our Hag Sameach video on Pentecost. And then the last one that we're going to have, actually, the Vocab Malone one's going to be on Sunday. What we were going to do on Friday is going to be a weekly occurrence from here on out, as is the Breakfast Teas on Wednesday. So every Wednesday, we're going to have these video essays out, hopefully, Lord willing. And that's going to be called, again, Breakfast Tea every Wednesday at hopefully 10 a.m., with the exception of this particular Wednesday. It'll still be up tomorrow, but I doubt I can actually get it out by 10 a.m. I digress. And then every Friday night, we're going to start doing Sabbath night open mics, right? So I like to do open mics. I don't like to do too much open mics, and everybody else likes to kind of join in on open mics, of course, because they get a chance to speak. So what we're going to do is every Friday night, we're going to have a open mic episode, and that's going to be our Sabbath night open mics. Why Sabbath night? Well, because the Sabbath actually begins on Friday afternoon after the descent of the sun, right after sundown. So that'll just be kind of a fun little way to, kind of honor that and have good discussions. And I think it'll be fun. Hopefully you guys are interested in that sort of thing. But nonetheless, after all that stuff, we do also have 2 interviews on August the 10th. I'm going to be interviewing David Roll on his new Legendary Kings books. That's going to be 10 a.m. Mountain Time on August the 10th. And then on the same day, August the 10th, about 6 p.m., we're going to be having, again, Mountain Time, we're going to be having a conversation about physicalism with Chris Date. So that'll be certainly a very interesting conversation. Chris and David both have been on the channel numerous times before. Very much fans of both of them, and have a fairly decent relationship with Chris especially. But even David, it's not like I am simply talking to him every now and then kind of thing, right? Obviously not to any degree of like somebody personally, but you guys know what I mean. So the point is they're friends of the channel. So I appreciate them both tremendously. And then let's see. Other things we got for channel housekeeping. I got a couple of debates this month, August the 12th, on Standing for Truth. We're going to be having a conversation with, I think, Will Kinney. Yeah, Will Kinney. And that conversation is going to be on whether or not the Bible teaches the openly taking the affirmative in that. And of course, that's going to be a very interesting conversation. I think that'll be the first open theist conversation on Standing for Truth. So that's definitely an honor. 8 days later, August the 20th, we'll be having a conversation with Let's see, David Preston. With David Preston, we're going to be having a conversation on whether or not the modern translations of the Bible are negative. He's a King James onlyist, so he'll be taking the position they are. I'm taking the negative there again. I don't believe that all of them are trustworthy, but I certainly believe some modern translations are trustworthy. I've elsewhere indicated that I do like the New King James. I do like the Lambda translation. I do like the North American Standard. Now, of course, I'm not some textual expert, don't get me wrong, but just from everything I've been able to personally gather, while my preferred is still the KJV, I do think there are conversations. Having a very excellent conversation, I think, on that. I plan to have a response to a blog post he wrote responding to me on my arguments for annihilationism before that actually ends up happening. He's actually shared with me them, and I want to share with him, resources at some point. Very awesome. I actually did this before with Rob Rowe, but unfortunately for Rob, I never actually ended up getting him my argument, which was kind of terrible in a way, because it was like I had this unfair advantage against him because I knew everything he was going to say, and he didn't know anything that I was going to say. And I am very much sorry for that, by the way. That was kind of lame. But I digress. Lots of really cool stuff happening here in August. If you're interested in any of your content, of course, you're going to get notifications. Get notified of every time we go live things. Just subscribe. Let's go ahead and jump into a quick prayer. Thank you for the opportunity to make this video yet again, Lord. I want to pray for nothing but edification to your body, Lord Jesus, and that nothing but honest speech and edifying speech and speech that educates in your word comes out of me today, Lord Jesus. I pray that we are all anointed, me and the audience, Lord Jesus, by your Holy Spirit, that we might actually seek to understand you greater and seek to understand your word greater, Lord Jesus, to understand the history of the faith you've passed down through the prophets and apostles and everyone else who you've passed it down through in the last 2,000 years since. And I pray that we come to greater revelation relationship with you, Jesus Christ, Lord. Excuse me. Is to essay 15,000 words. I'm not sure what that means, to be honest with you. Anyways, so we have a interesting conversation. This is in a series responding to an interview I did with Dr. David Falk, where to the late view and our for the early view. We have already gone through about 20, and it's just 2 episodes. And today the goal is to get through 30 interview. So we'll see what actually happens. Perhaps finding out there's some very refutation, obviously, you seem to enjoy as well. I am being told it sounds like a loose cord. I apologize for that. Got a little bit. All right. I do apologize, friends. Forward. So right where I thought about the time here. Hope you guys are edified. Yeah, to it. There's really neat introduction, inspiring Dr. So I have now. I've tweeted up on his because they're the tabs on your one sort of. I don't know what you would call it. You have two different like your StreamYard right next to your YouTube video, right next to the whole thing. You can all see them, and then there's like tabs you have that hang out on the lower part. I don't know. Anyways, I'm making a fool of myself right now, so let's just pull it up. Let me guys. Let me know if any of you guys know what that's actually called, the difference between those two kinds of tabs. But at any rate, I digress. Pull this video up here. Appreciate your patience, friends. And again, we're starting at about the 29-minute mark in this video. All right, now we got it up. I sound very laggy. I have my microphone in as well as my Ethernet cord in, so I'm not sure why I would be lagging at the moment. And this is just a great start to the video, right? Absolutely epic start to the video. Smashing. I'm going to go ahead and jump in and all right. Hopefully that makes stuff better. This video started absolutely awfully, so I want to just go ahead and jump into the conversation we're having. Let me know if it's still bad. Obviously, we don't want this to be low quality, but nonetheless, we're going to try and power through. So here's the video. Going to about the 29-minute mark. Let's just go ahead and press play. Jump right in. And yeah, appreciate you guys.
Get out of the water. Now, I did realize that it did not say Israel like it said. It was the Berlin pedestal. Yeah. And for those who don't know where, it's a pedestal that's been fragmented. And it mentions a couple places in Canaan. And on the end, there's another piece. And there was a scholar named Gorg who tried to reconstruct it and says this fragmented piece mentioned Israel. And it dates to about 1350 BCE. And I was like, okay, well, then that kind of blows the lake gate out of the water. Now, I did realize that it did not say Israel like it says in the Bernetta Stele. But I was like, okay, maybe it's just a variation on the name. And, it's about simplification. Why posit an entirely new people group when we got Israel that we know was in Canaan, and it can fit with the early age of the Exodus?
So that's not this startup was a little bit misleading, I think, and we're going to figure out why as we go on. So to recap, what they're talking about here is there is an artifact known as the Berlin pedestal, which has been interpreted by some Egyptologists to, I believe that they're Egyptologists. I don't know their exact positions, but they are PhDs in relevant fields. Well, no, Vanderheen is definitely an Egyptologist. Anyways, so has been identified by some as being a reference to Israel. It's obviously controversial. It's controversial for a couple reasons. The first one being we're not sure if it actually does say Israel. And the second one being that we're not sure when exactly it dates to, right? So those are the two big problems that we have when trying to say this is definitive evidence for Israel at the time it's said to be. Now, the time it's said to be is 14th century, potentially really early in the 13th century. And others would argue that it would be around the Ramesside period later on in the 13th century, but they'll make that argument here because that's what Dr. David Falk believes, right? Now, what IP was saying here, so he has a couple things talking about how he realizes that it was spelled differently, and also it's about simplification, making sure that we don't have, a complicated third ethnic group that doesn't exist, that we have to create. Seemingly, it doesn't fit in the historical record when we already have a group that sounds like this that lives in the area, right? But there are actually a series of arguments laid out for why people believe this to be a reference to Israel, and it's not simply just, a matter of simplification or anything like that. On top of that, and I think this is probably the bigger issue we have here, the spelling problem is a problem that's not limited simply to the reference to Israel, right? In other words, the other two references we have there, Ashkelon and Canaan, as we're going to see here later on, are actually also spelled differently than we tend to see them spelled, which is a very interesting thing, I think. But nonetheless, let's just continue forward with that. I just thought it wasn't a particularly honest way to set it forward, I guess. But nonetheless.
Why posit an entirely new people group there that we don't have any evidence for, that ends in some sort of a Yah name, that whatnot. It just could just be Israel, just be a variation on the name. What's wrong with that? And what's wrong with the Berlin pedestal dating it to 1350? You're actually, and you can mention this, so you've made a paper coming out on this eventually.
I am working on a paper on this in my copious free time. That's the problem with that particular paper. I've been working on it a long time and just haven't had the time to finish it. I think it's a reconstruction problem, and basically, if I say what that reconstruction is, I sort of let the cat out of the bag on that one.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to mention that, but there is a reconstruction. If I mention what that reconstruction issue is, it'd be obvious to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
However, many people have questioned the dating of that to the reign of Amenhotep II, not the least of which is Robert Rittner. Basically is, he's an Egyptologist. He was an Egyptologist. He's just recently deceased, from the University of Chicago. And he dates the pedestal to the reign of Ramses II. Okay. So there's actually, at this point, because of the depth of the inscriptions involved here.
Real quickly, it is important to note that I am not somebody who has a large deal of knowledge about this particular artifact, and as such, we're actually going to read somebody else putting forward the position that tries to argue for it being true, which I am not necessarily going to endorse or advocate or anything like that. I just think that it would be good to see what the opposing evidence is, but I'm not really sold or anything like that, because I don't really have the knowledge to be sold. So I do want to point that out real quick. Also, as a result, I'll be paused here for a minute just to listen, because I won't have much to say until we get the whole point out. So I just wanted to let you guys know that real briefly. But anyways,
there's deep misgivings about that original dating by Gork.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, one of the things you notice when you say look at inscriptions of the New Kingdom is there's this pattern of people doing their inscriptions, and then later king coming on, rubbing them out, and then putting their own inscriptions out over this. During the reign of King Ramses, and even his predecessor Seti I, started doing very, very deep inscriptions to make it almost impossible for people to rub out. I mean, you can go to Luxor and you can stick your hand in some of these inscriptions, and you'll notice that some of those inscriptions are like 6 inches deep into rock. Okay? They're there so that nobody can overwrite them. So then you got the Berlin pedestal, which has deep inscriptions. That's going to mark it to a much later date. That's going to mark it to a 19th dynasty date instead of an 18th dynasty date. Right? Mm-hmm. So then we come to the matter of, say, the Captive Circle itself. Now, that raises new issues. Okay? That raises issues that, okay, is this we're then saying that just this inscription alone is basically saying that this particular ethnic group or town had been captured and enslaved or conquered. Okay? So by ascribing this to, say, Israel, you're basically admitting that Israel was conquered and captured.
All right, so that's one of the first real big boo-boos we're going to address in this particular response video. He says that the group being referenced here is being captured, and therefore that would be a problem. because you would be admitting that the Israelites are somehow being captured around the time that this is meant to be, which he just said that he thinks there's some evidence it could be to Ramses. Obviously, like I said, we're going to read an argument against that, which I'll neither be endorsing nor negating. But this notion that because the Egyptians said that there was some captured Israelites, that means, therefore, we must conclude that the Egyptians, if this indeed was Israel, had captured the Israelites, or at least a great deal of Israelites, an amount that would be worthy of note, something like that, right? But of course, this is just simply not the case. One of the reasons we know this isn't the case is because of the commonly accepted earliest reference to Israel, and that would be the Merneptah Stele. The Merneptah Stele, which is said to date to around 1208 BC, according to conventional chronologies, and is also agreed to be the oldest, agreed by most at least, to be the oldest reference, confirmed reference to Israel that we have extant, says that Israel is laid waste. This is a direct quote, Israel is laid waste and its seed is no more, right? So what we would have to conclude, if indeed, using Dr. Falk's logic, what we would have to conclude, if indeed the Merneptah Stele is actually referencing Israel, is that Israel around 1208 BC was laid waste and was no longer. Its seed was no longer. Now, of course, this is incredibly problematic, especially for a late date view. And let me say why for both. For the early date view, it's because this would be smack dab in the middle of the period of the judges. And so if indeed, and I'm only saying if the Merneptah Stele was literally true, by the way, I don't think it's actually a problem. But nonetheless, if it was literally true, right, well then around the period, just roughly a century before you're going to see King David, around the time of, I would say, let's see, it wouldn't be quite Jephthah yet. Jephthah is considered to be around 1100 BC. I guess I'm not 100% sure what's going on in 1200 BC off the top of my head, but I'll have to look back at my notes there. Regardless, it's about 100 years before Jephthah, about 2 centuries before David. I should have said 1 century before David. That was incorrect. About 2 centuries before David, right? That Israel would be apparently destroyed and would have no more seed, in fact, even though this is not referenced anywhere in the book of Judges. Now, if you're a late dater, this problem would get even worse because Israel was apparently destroyed and had no more seed like 15 years after the conquest took place. The late date says roughly that 1265 is when the Exodus takes place. 40 years later, 1225 or thereabouts is where the conquest takes place. And the conquest is commonly believed to be about 7 years. So that would put us at 1218 circa for the end of the conquest on the late date, right? But in 1208, Israel is destroyed, it's laid waste, its seed is no longer. I wonder what to do with the book of Judges at that point, or really the rest of the Bible, right? You can see how that's a pretty massive problem, especially considering that Egypt should be kind of wrecked at this point. The Exodus certainly would not be a small event. Your entire slave population leaving, or at least a great deal of them. Obviously, the plagues were incredibly dramatic and would not be beneficial by any stretch of the imagination, right? So on and so forth. You could see all the problems that would kind of pile up here, right? So if the Merneptah Stele is literally true, in other words, if it is true that the Egyptians around 1208 BC, or maybe a little bit before, we'll even say a couple decades before, actually destroyed Israel and rendered their seed no more, then we have a problem because they're referring to Israel, right? It's the same thing that he's actually talking about here. Or the other possibility here, which is the possibility that's true in both instances, I think, is that the Egyptians like to exaggerate and they're not incredibly trustworthy when they talk about themselves in these matters. This is something everybody knows. It's the explanation we all currently have surrounding the Merneptah Stele. Yeah, it does say that Israel's destroyed, its seed is no more, but this is propaganda, right? And it's not just with that particular situation where we say this. We have other situations where we say this as well. Like, for example, when it comes to the Battle of Kadesh between Ramses II and I think it's Suppiluliuma, if I remember correctly. But nonetheless, one of the Hittite kings. It's not Suppiluliuma, actually. It doesn't matter. I don't even care about the Hittites, to be honest with you. I know very little about them. But I do know about this particular battle, right? It takes place, I think, 1274 BC. And again, Ramses II, Ramses the Great, right? The same Ramses who would be reigning in the period they say the Exodus took place. the same one you're going to see in your Prince of Egypt and Ten Commandments movies, right? He goes up and fights the Hittites in Kadesh, which is in modern day Israel. And there's a big battle there. It's the largest battle up to that point, at least people think, because we don't have any record of anything before that. It gives us our first ever peace treaty that we have extant. Excuse me. And one of the things that's very interesting about it is when Ramses tells the story, it's this glorious Egyptian tale of coming over, overcoming these ridiculous odds and actually having this fantastic victory and all this other kind of stuff, right? And in the peace treaty, and in using all the outside evidence, it appears that it was a draw, and probably barely a draw. Like Ramses very likely could have lost this battle, and I don't mean likely in the sense that that's something that happened, but I mean likely in the sense that at the time that it was going on, there was probably a large portion of that battle where it was like, man, we might lose, kind of thing, right? That's what historians tend to agree on. And this is something that's going to go on throughout Egyptian history. It happens with a lot of countries. Egypt's not unique in this regard. But the point is that we actually have to concede no such thing when it comes to the Berlin pedestal. It says that Israel's captured. Okay, fine. Well, it says that Israel was laid waste and it's seed no more with the Merneptah stele. We know that that's not correct. So we could just say the same thing here. They're exaggerating. This is propaganda. It's not an accurate representation of what literally happened, right? It's a little disappointing to see somebody like Dr. Falk, who would know that this is the kind of thing that you see in Egyptian history, to not make this connection himself. I would argue he probably does make the connection himself, but he just doesn't think that it is, how would you say this? It doesn't help his view, right? And so he's not going to bring it up. That's just what I think, but hey, I'm sticking to it, right? The point here, I think, can be seen very obviously. We actually have to concede no such thing. Now, if it was written in the time of Ramses, of course, then that's a different conversation. But there is some other things here to get to, so we're going to go ahead and just press play.
That's going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
The second problem is the whole the transliteration issue on the Berlin pedestal, which is it doesn't actually say Israel. In fact, in order for Gorg and the others who were involved to actually interpret that as Israel, you almost have to slur your words. It's kind of like, okay, you drink a half bottle of scotch and you might be able to read Israel out of that. It's that sort of deal, because the consonants are nothing like what we know of the toponym Israel. When we look at Israel, we see yes.
I do just want to point out real quick that you see this just flagrant disregard for the other side and what it is that they have to say. Constantly accusing them of things, accusing them of being morons, accusing them of manipulating the data, accusing them essentially of being dishonest is what you're saying when you say they manipulate the data. Talking about, it's like being drunk, you know what I mean? That's how you could probably get this. Obviously, you can do whatever you wish. I'm not, sitting here to write like a sob story or anything like that. But I do just want to point out that a lot of people get real sensitive about some of the stuff that I've said personally about Dr. Falk. And I'm not about to start right now because I don't want to taint this video, but I do just want to point out, if the criticism is not something that I'm supposed to be able to say because of the fact that I don't have a PhD, but then you move to the people who do have PhDs and work in this field, and your disrespect of them is just as flagrant, then I kind of think you're just pleading, right? It's like when we have the degrees, then the people who don't, well, you don't have the degrees. Or it's from something that's non-accredited, like he trashes James White all the time for. or it's from that university, right? How many times have people seen something from like Liberty University and been like, oh yeah, that's not a real college, that kind of stuff, right? And then once you do actually have the PhD from the university that they accept and all that, it's like, okay, yeah, but your theories are still not accepted, so it still doesn't matter. We're gonna disrespect you just as flagrantly. We have completely new reasons now. Those are the reasons we gave you before. You rectified those reasons, so now we need to make up new reasons, because in reality, it's not actually the reasons. It's just that we're trying to lord our position as a consensus of scholars over you. Obviously, we just had Dr. Douglas Petrovich on. I didn't agree with everything Douglas Petrovich said. I obviously agree with a huge deal of what he said. Same thing with David Roll when we've had him on, and others, right? These guys who do research this stuff all the time, regardless of if they're right or wrong, regardless of if they are even wildly fringe, like people would say of David Roll, they are putting in the work. They have put in the study. They do the same things that everybody says. How could you say that about him? He's done this, that, and the other, and thus and such, right? Okay, well, they have, and y'all are saying it all the time. You're flagrantly disrespectful all the time. And it's just a little hypocritical. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. At any rate, he's making a point. Let's let him make the point, right?
And it starts with why.
Why do I care so much what people think about me? I think I'm gay.
Whack.
It starts with why. Even for example, in say Hebrew, it's not Israel, it's Yisrael.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, just real quick, I put the Berlin pedestal up on the screen, and off to the far side, you can see the fragment version that Gorg says is Israel, and a variation of it, just so you people are aware. That's what we're talking about right there. They're trying to reconstruct that and say it's Israel, and then say it dates to 1350, which, as Dr. Falk already addressed, it may not entirely.
Yeah. So on the very top part of that captive circle, you have a reed leaf and an aleph, a vulture aleph, and we would normally read this in Egyptian as Iya, not Ya, not Ya. It's not a Y. A Y is a double reed leaf. We find that in the Merneptah stela that uses the double reed leaf. So this is really not like the Merneptah stela at all. The second letter is that sort of patch of papyrus, which is Shah. It's a sheen plus an aleph, so Shah. But this is not anything like what we find in Israel, which has a hard sibilant S. So it's Yisra, not Yasha. And there's no R here, no resh. What Gork is having to do is he's having to sort of slur a resh in here to make it sort of fit. I mean, it's, as I said, it's drunken epigraphy. It's drunken epigraphy.
And just to add, I'm not going to spill the beans, but your paper coming out is going to provide a much better explanation for who this inscription is. So there is another people group in Canaan that would better fit with what we see here. And so I'm really looking forward to that. I think it'll be great. But yeah, I think there's a lot of problems here. I think once again, early day proponents
even if you didn't have that alternate reading, this is not a viable reading. It's just not a viable reading because you have to slur so much together to make it work. It just can't work.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It doesn't to make it be Israel, you got to strain credulity. You really got to strain what's being pronounced here to make it fit. Yeah. And early day proponents tend to ignore that and just say it says Israel. Move on anyway. End of the day, don't question this anymore. And
now, of course, that's not something that any early daters do, and he would not be able to back that up if he tried. And he knows that. Inspiring philosophy knows that, and yet he decides to slander his opponents for no apparent reason. I don't understand why. He should talk to Dr. Petrovich at some point. He's a nice guy. Bryant Wood also. A lot of these guys are nice guys. At any rate, but you know what's interesting is the other side actually does do that. They absolutely do that, right? If you question them, as we see in this video, they accuse you of dishonesty. They accuse you of being rigidly cultist. They accuse you of, having to create this drunken epigraphy, all this other kind of stuff, right? It's just ironic to me. It's ironic to me because the exact same thing that they are accusing of. Hey, don't question any of this stuff. You can't question any of this stuff. That's what they do. That's precisely what they do. And I don't understand why. I don't know. I don't get it. What can I tell you? I do not understand why people think that it's a winning strategy. The ridiculous thing is, I guess, in the sense of getting a lot of views, it is a winning strategy, right? I've even benefited from the causing controversy thing a lot, sometimes unintentionally and sometimes intentionally. It's not a good thing when you do it intentionally, obviously, but I'd be a hypocrite if I said I didn't do it for sure, right? I mean, I think every YouTuber in our field has probably at least had the temptation, which doesn't justify anything, but it is a thing. But obviously, it's not helpful. And in the case of inspiring philosophy, and especially Dr. Falk, it's really consistent. I've yet to ever see Dr. Falk tell me one person who disagrees with him that he has respect for. Douglas Petrovich, he thinks is a joke. David Roll, he thinks is a joke. Scott Stripling, he thinks is a joke. Bryant Wood, he thinks is a joke. Titus Kennedy, he thinks is a joke. I mean, you can just go down the line of these people who are scholars in the relevant fields. Joke. And for the record, a lot of the atheist ones who are also scholars in the relevant fields, you would also think of as jokes, right? Like Kip Davis, for example, or Joshua Bowen, for example. It's the exact thing that he accuses other people of. Don't, how dare you question these things? I don't know. To be honest, I've dedicated too much time to this particular part, but I feel like it's something I always end up needing to comment on because it's always a thing that comes up in these videos. Oh, hey, what do you know? Mecha Tanky Stalinist, who is in our live chat, is in this portion of the live chat on their video. Spooky. I'm just kidding.
So when I think when you and I were talking, you pointed that out to me, it really sort of opened my eyes to the problems with that. Another issue, though, that I sort of jumped to for the early day was the Amarna letters. And the reason I did is because even Kenneth Kitchen said in his book on the reliability of the Old Testament, it says it sounds like a good.
All right, note this. All right, so I gotta. This is gonna get a little bit offensive for some of you who are Falk fans, but we're gonna see some outright dishonesty coming forward here. At least I think. And the reason I specify it that way is because perhaps it is the case that Dr. Falk is just not actually aware, and Inspiring Philosophy is just not actually aware of what people are saying on this matter and what people have said on this matter. But they're going to characterize the early date ideas surrounding the Amarna letters in a very dishonest way. And there's nothing else to say but that. It is incredibly dishonest. I think they either do not actually know what their opposition is saying about this issue, or they are manipulating the data to try and make their own position look better. I don't know. I'm neither of them, and I frankly don't even really care because the fact of the matter is the result is the same. The position is strawmanned, is not accurately represented, and it is made to appear ridiculous, and then you're allowed to, of course, light that ridiculous straw man on fire and get yourself a nice burning clown in the cornfield. You guys are going to see exactly what I'm talking about here. We're going to be pretty thorough with this portion. But this would be a good place to have it paused because there was something else I wanted to read for you guys about the stela, the Berlin pedestal there, right? So let's go ahead and stop the screen share here and read something else very briefly. Let's see here. All right, so here's a case from some of the people who do believe this Berlin pedestal dates to the mid-14th century, and they'll be able to provide, obviously, much better information than I would, so we're just going to go ahead and take a brief pause to read. Again, I'm not necessarily endorsing this article or negating anything therein, just presenting the opposite side here so that you guys know why some have suggested this is evidence for Israel that is, of course, dating to before the Merneptah Stele. which I think actually, if I understand what Dr. Falk had just said earlier, this probably still would date to before the Merneptah Stele in the Ramesside period, more specifically in Ramesses' own reign. Although maybe not necessarily, because I guess he did say Merneptah would also have a similar way of communicating this. So if this was a reference to Israel, which of course he doesn't think it is, but if it was a reference to Israel, I think it would still, regardless of the dating, end up the oldest reference to Israel. Anyways, this is from Armstrong Institute of Biblical Archaeology. The writer of this article is Christopher Eames, and it came out, I think you pronounce his last name Eames, and it came out January 14th, 2019. So, the Merneptah Stele, also known as the Israel Stele, is well known for containing the earliest mention of the word Israel to circa 1207 BC. I had said 1208 BC earlier, of course, but same, time frame there. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. It's the earliest undisputed artifact containing the word Israel. There is another piece that may date up to 2 centuries earlier, only this one is fragmentary and is still technically classified as disputed. In this article, we examine the fascinating artifact that purports to knock Sir Pietri's infamous Merneptah Stele off its throne, the Berlin pedestal. So, first they talk about an elusive vulture. We'll try to make this quick. The Berlin pedestal is a stone inscription acquired by Egyptologist Ludwig, I'm totally going to pronounce this wrong, sorry, Borcard, from an Egyptian merchant in 1913. The piece, roughly 40 by 45 centimeters, which would be 15.75 by 17.72 inches, was probably part of a pedestal base. While the inscribed face is broken off at the edges, a sizable amount of imagery is preserved. 3 captives are displayed, tied together at the neck, and depicting in the classic Egyptian West Asiatic form, a general depiction of Middle Easterners, which would be the West Asiatics they're talking about there. Each prisoner has corresponding name ring, labeling the country of origin for the prisoner in hieroglyphic script. And there's the picture. You just saw IP and Dr. Falk showing it on their own screen as well. The first ring on the left side clearly reads Ashkelon, referring to the coastal city generally occupied by the Philistines as part of their Pentapolis, which is a grouping of 5 cities. The middle ring clearly reads Canaan. The broken name ring on the right is the one in question. There has been some debate as to what the missing hieroglyphic letter in the upper right-hand portion of the ring is. One of the chief translators of the slab, Professor Manfred Gorg, who proposed the name Israel, believes it to be a vulture symbol due to the preserved beak-like incision. Gorg completed his research in 2001. Since that time, additional research has been done, including specially lit photography and 3D scanning. This has provided as good as certain evidence that his hieroglyph is indeed the vulture, along with the beak, the left leg, and claw is also apparent, as well as belly outline. This then completes the full name ring, but that's only the beginning of the debate. There you have a reconstructed version of it. This one on the far right would be the one that they would like to say is Israel. And this right here is the vulture in question. With the vulture motif, the pure translation of the name ring is ISIR. The name is unique. It is not known in this form on any topographical list. However, there is real complexity to Egyptian spelling. The same hieroglyphs can sometimes represent entirely different sounds. R is also used to represent the L. He had just talked about how there was no R there, but it's possible the last letter here, which is actually a R, could be a L. And you see the same thing that happens, in Hebrew and also in our own language, right? For example, the C sound could be a K or could be a S. For example, sent and can, right? In Hebrew, you have the Vav, which is said either to, or actually the vet would be a better example, because I think those who believe the Wa is the proper pronunciation don't actually believe Va is a proper pronunciation. But nonetheless, in the case of the vet or bet, there you actually just had an idea of what the 2 pronunciations can be, right? It can be Va or it can be Ba. For example, Havel, which is the Hebrew name Abel, right? It actually means breath or smoke. That's that same letter there, right? And then what would be a good example? Let me see. Bara, right? Bereshit bara Elohim from the Genesis 1. That would be an example of it being used to make a B sound, right? So obviously, just like any other language, multiple symbols, I should say, because I don't think hieroglyphs are technically speaking letters, can have multiple sounds that come out of them depending on context in the word and things like that, right? Anyways. R is also used to represent the sound L. As a modern example, many Chinese confuse the sounds R and L. See the city of Rome, which is translated as Luoma. Rome/Roma, translated as Luoma or Luoma. I don't know exactly how you pronounce that. Anyways, due to their form in the word, the final hieroglyphs are best translated as an L sound in representation of the Hebrew theophoric L. A glottal stop with no English equivalent can also be interchangeably translated as either R or L. Based on this, Gorg, as well as later researchers Dr. Peter van der Veen and Dr. Christopher Thies, concluded that the hieroglyphic name is best translated as Israel, or Israel, right? The name then becomes clearly evident as Israel. One of the strongest proofs that this is the correct and most logical translation is simply the other two names on the pedestal, Ashkelon and Canaan, all the same region, right? Both of these territories are in the same general proximity within the Promised Land, thus Israel is by far the best fit. And the Merneptah Stele provides further corroboration for this meaning. Toward the end of the stele, we read the following: Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is not. Notice there, if we accept that's Israel, we have to accept that Israel is laid waste and its seed is not, using Dr. Falk's previous argumentation. But of course, we don't do that because we know the Egyptians exaggerate and propagandize and make stuff up. Anyways, here we have in succession the names Canaan, Ashkelon, and Israel, grouped together due to regional proximity in describing the Egyptian conquest. As such, it only makes sense to translate the Berlin pedestal in the same way. The weight of evidence supports the Berlin pedestal's translation as Israel. Other proposed rearrangements of the word do not have supporting evidence. For a more in-depth look at the technicalities surrounding the inscription, here's a thorough analysis by Van der Veen and Thies, and you can click that link there. I'll go ahead and drop the link to this article in the live chat once I'm done. As above, but what date? As above, the Merneptah Stele dates to 1207 BC. That would be, sorry, it's not letting me scroll back up. I don't know why it does that sometimes. This right here, that's the Merneptah Stele. Obviously, you can't see hardly anything on it from your position, probably, but nonetheless. By the way, Redefine Living and Graham, shalom to you both, and thank you for being here. Appreciate you guys. Oh, this computer's being whack. Anyways, as above, the Merneptah Stele dates to 1207 BC, which is Egypt's 19th dynasty. The dating of the Berlin pedestal is difficult to pin down since it was not discovered in situ. Some have speculated that the pedestal dates to around the same time as the Merneptah Stele, primarily because it lists the names in a similar fashion. One such theory is that the pedestal was constructed around the time of Ramses II's reign, which is 1279 to 1213, due to some potential parallel iconographic features from his reign. That's what Dr. Falk was just talking about with the deep hieroglyphs there, right, that are indicative of something from the Ramesside period, either Ramses or Merneptah. And so that's what they're referencing there as far as the, iconographic features and all that. However, there is another, perhaps far stronger method of dating this pedestal, the spelling. Excuse me. And by the way, it probably should be noted, I'm sure most people probably don't know what in situ means. I certainly have had to look up a lot of these words, as far as the studying here. And through the years, it's been, actually great for my vocabulary, to be honest with you, because you just expand so much with these educational terms. Which I only say to say, I'm not judging anybody, right? I understand people don't necessarily always know the terms. I don't always know the terms, right? And you guys sometimes even see that. But in regards to this particular, oh my goodness, I can't even talk. In regards to this particular phrase, it means in the original position. The exact phraseology is actually in position. So that's what it would refer to in the original position. I think it's actually on site or in sight, which is that situ portion. But anyways, the spelling for the region on the Berlin pedestal actually contains a fair number of differences to the Merneptah Stele. All three locations are spelled differently. Let me say that again. All three locations are spelled differently. All three of them. So they sit here and they talk about how it's such a big problem that this Israel would be spelled differently, but Ashkelon and Canaan are also spelled differently. In other words, it actually fits with what's being presented by the artifact. And by the way, it's not like it's a super rare thing for a word to change its spelling over time. I think a perfect example of that is the English word demon. If you read Frankenstein unabridged, which is only 200 years ago, demon has an A in it. Now, obviously, that's not a very dramatic difference, but you still get the idea. The word is changed as far as how you spell it. You can see, if you ever play any word games, you can see tons of these because the British tend to have different spellings than we do, excuse me. And you can see this with like things like Ole Miss. Ole is usually a shortened version, but obviously that demonstrates a different version of the name old. Same word, different spellings, right? Now, does that happen with the names of countries and stuff like that? Well, obviously, of course it would. One example that's kind of funny, it's a name to a country, but Amerigo Vespucci and America, right? Obviously, you see some spelling has, has changed there. In the case of ear, we now call it Ireland, right? Well, that originally comes from Ireland, so the land of ear, right? And then that becomes Ireland over time. And obviously the spelling changes as we move forward. I'm trying to think of an example that might be a little bit more familiar to people than that, but I don't know if I can think of one in like America, like the spelling of something in America had changed. I'm not something that's off, coming to me off the top of my head, but at any rate, you get the idea, right? Toponyms can change over time. Words can change over time. It's not a problem, is the point. The spelling for the regions of the Berlin pedestal, actually, I already just read that. Based on writing alone, the Berlin pedestal actually resembles the spelling of the 18th dynasty, thus putting the pedestal within a time frame of 1550 to 1290 BC. Notice that one of the things that's in one of the things that people are criticized for as far as their dating to 1350 is actually part of the answer to, or potentially at least, we don't want to assume, could be part of the answer to why this is spelt differently. Anyways, more thus putting the pedestal within a time frame of 1550 to 1290. More specifically, the writing closely parallels that of the early to middle 18th dynasty around the time of Amenhotep's II and III, which is 1427 to 1351. If this is correct, then that places, the Israel, the Berlin pedestal, up to as many as 2 centuries before Merneptah Steles Israel. It is also possible that the names were inscribed under the pedestal during a later period, again, closer to the reign of Ramses II, but that these had been copied from an earlier list. Again, though this still attests to the early nature of the regional names for them Again, though, this still attests to the earlier nature, I'm trying to read this fast and I'm not doing it very well, of their regional names for them to be better copied in archaic form. Personally, I lean toward let's scroll down here, earlier creation of the pedestal, perhaps around 1300 BC or earlier. It strikes as unusual for the Egyptian scribe to carefully engrave more ancient forms of place names into the victory pedestal rather than using more contemporary vernacular. All right, we'll stop the reading there. As you guys can see, there's some stuff they're leaving out, right? They're leaving out how one of their questions is potentially answered by another one of the points that they have against this dating. They leave out the fact that all of these things are misspelled. They leave out the facts that there is actually, or not misspelled, but spelled differently, right? They leave out the fact that there is actually decent reason for constructing this the way it's been constructed, and they leave out the fact that it's more than just one off-color fringe guy, but actually it's a couple of different experts who are actually saying that, hey, this is the understanding of, what this should be, or at least what we think it should be. So just wanted to read that here real quick. Let's get to this fun stuff about the Amarna letters. We've probably already been going almost an hour. So let's go ahead and jump right into the video again. Please remember to like and share the video while I'm paused here. Consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so, and hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Here we go again.
A model for how Joshua's conquest would later happen. It seems like they start around the area of Shechem and they raid these certain towns. And you could find, if you go through the Amarna letters, you could find little correlations here about a people group mentioned in Joshua that shows up in the Amarna letters, or certain towns that are attacked that are show up in the Amarna letters. And it's like, well, why not just say this is Israel? Because there are connections. I don't even agree that Habiru, that are mentioned in the Amarna letters attacking Canaan, met Heber. I just would say, well, the Hebrews were a type of Habiru. So what's wrong with the Amarna letters? Why cannot we use that for an early date conquest? Because the Amarna letters date to about, they want to say 1400, but really it's a little later. It's about in the 1300s.
Okay. No, they do not want to say to the 1400s. I don't know where he's getting that information. I, as somebody who listens to these people quite frequently, never heard Scott Stripling say that. Never heard Titus Kennedy say that. Never heard Douglas Petrovich say that. Never heard David Roll say that. Never heard Brian Wood say that. Never heard anybody at ABR say that. I don't know anybody who dates it to 1400. So I don't know where Inspiring Philosophy is getting that information from. I assume that the Egyptologist sitting right next to him is at least signing off on this information, considering the fact that he's not correcting him. I don't know. None of them say that. We're going to demonstrate it here in just a moment, but none of them say that. As far as the whole Habiru thing, both Dr. Petrovich and David Roll have been on this channel saying they believe Habiru is related to Hebrew. And they acknowledge that this, which is something that they're going to talk about later, as if it's not acknowledged, but it is acknowledged. They acknowledge that this is a class distinction, but the thinking goes that the class distinction has become an ethnonym, right? Or ethnonym, excuse me, which isn't something that's entirely out of the ordinary, right? For example, if you live in the United States, the term native typically refers to the Native American tribes, right? Somebody who is of Native American descent. Now, the word native itself is just a distinction as far as were you born here or did you immigrate here, something like that, right? Like, for example, I'm not a native of Idaho. I was born in Nevada. Grew up the first 14 years of my life in Nevada. So even though I've been living in Idaho for the last 10 years, not a native. You could say immigrant, transient, whatever you want to use. Point is not native. But that word now is used to describe, even by itself, apart from the word American, to describe the original inhabitants of this continent, right? Call them just natives. A lot of times you'll hear people in Australia referred to as Aborigines. It's the same kind of thing that you have going on there, right? So what they're thinking is that the class distinction eventually becomes a name for the ethnic group of Hebrews, right? Which is not something that's impossible. Obviously, just gave some examples of how it does happen. With that said, I actually do agree that Habiru is not, I don't think that it's just that it is derived from Hebrew. One of the main reasons for that is actually the spelling of the word Hebrew in the Hebrew, right? So it's Ivrit, not Hebrew. Hebrew is the English version of that, right? Ivrit. The first letter is an ayin. The second letter is a bet, making the V sound. Then we have a resh. Then we have a yud, which makes that y sound. And then we have a tav, right? So that ayin has a silent sound. It does come before words that have very different sounds coming out of it. So it's possible that the sound it made was probably some like deep guttural ah. But like, for example, the word Gomorrah and the word Amos would both start with an ayin, but it's considered to be silent in modern Hebrew, right? So that's one of the, words that we would have there. Not an H, which would be like, I think, hey is how you pronounce it. I want to say hav. I don't know why my brain wants to say hav, but hey. That's retarded. It's definitely not a hav. Hey. So Hebrew, that H sound would start with a hey. And then its next one would be that bet, obviously. So you have the same thing there. And then the resh would also be there as well. So Habiru, you would have the hey, then you'd have your bet, then you'd have your resh. The first letter there is wrong, but the next two letters are right. But then Ivrit doesn't stop there. It also has a yud and also has a tav, right? Which would be a Y sound or an I sound. So, for example, Yehovah, it's the first letter there. But it would also make like an I sound like Levi, right? It's the last letter there. And then the tav is obviously a T, right? So, for example, Toda starts with that T. Point there being that the first letter is different. The next two letters are in one word, but not the other. I don't know if there's convincing evidence just based off of that alone to suggest that Habiru is somehow the etymological ancestor of Ivrit. I don't know that that is something that could be proven. I think it sounds better going from the Habiru to English than it does going from the Habiru to Hebrew, right? And so I do at least agree there on the initial skepticism that they have, as far as this referring to Habiru. I do want to point out, though, again, that those people, Petrovich Roll, all these other guys, right? They don't actually fail to acknowledge that this word is ultimately referring to a ethnic class, right? Or not an ethnic class, excuse me, a social class. They're just simply saying that they think it is like the predecessor of the word Hebrew. Like I said, in the same way things like native and aborigine have in our own modern day. But anyways, let's continue forward. There's deeper things to get to here.
Akhenaten. Yeah, you could. They do try to say that they want to push it back to the 1400s, and it's kind of
I can't push it to the 1400s.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Why can't you do that? And then
you can push it only.
Yeah, nobody does that, by the way. But nonetheless, let's just continue.
As early as 1389.
Okay.
Because 1389 is the beginning of the reign of Amenhotep III. Now, the Amarna letters that we have date to the end of his reign, not the beginning. But the end of his reign is 1351.
Now, just so the audience understands, the early day proponents want to say the conquest happened during Akhenaten's father Amenhotep III. Yes. And these Amarna letters are not dating to the reign of Amenhotep III. Some might be. Yeah.
Basically, these are the ones that we have from Amenhotep III are sort of the ones that sort of drifted in after his death. And this is very common, where a king would die, and the new king would get a few letters coming in that were sent in transit. Okay? Or they might bring in a couple letters that were either from the old archive, just to provide a little bit of literary context. But basically, every letter that we have of Amenhotep III at Amarna is from the end of his reign.
Mm-hmm. So yeah,
and that's
just 51. So just for clarification on chronology, guys, so the audience knows, early day proponents want to say that the conquest is happening during or before, about the beginning of Amenhotep III. Okay, so but the Amarna letters, the Amarna letters go much further up in time to the end of his son's reign. So they don't really date to the time the early day proponents say the conquest happened.
Yeah. This is going to be...
So, in case you're not following, we'll go ahead and reiterate. The idea is IP and Dr. Falk are claiming that early day proponents are using the Amarna letters to try and argue for evidence of the conquest of Canaan being earlier, and that the way that they're doing that is by saying these describe the conquest of Canaan, right? Which there is a very technical sense that you could say that's true, which would be that this is said to describe the period of Judges by early date proponents. We're going to look at them say it themselves. And you could count the period of Judges as, first off, an elongated conquest after the initial 7-year war to start, and then second off, periods of conquest and reconquest from, Ammonites to Hebrews again, to Philistines and Mesopotamian Hebrews again, so on and so forth, right? But obviously when we say the conquest, that's not what we're referring to. What we're referring to is that initial war that Joshua launched, right? Where they get a stranglehold there. They take over the center of the country. That's what we mean by the conquest. Now, early date proponents tend to say the conquest is about 1406 to 1399. 1406 because that's 40 years after 1446, which is 480 years before 966, commonly believed to be the 4th year of Solomon's reign, right? So Exodus happens 1446, 40 years later, conquest, therefore conquest happens 1406. And they commonly say that the conquest took about 5 to 7 years, but it's most commonly going to be 7 years. The Bible doesn't explicitly say that it took 7 years, but we do have Jewish tradition that says it took place for 7 years, for example, the Seder Olam. And that's typically the amount of time that the early date proponents will go with. I'm sure it's something similar in regards to the late date proponents. But to be honest with you, I've never actually looked at how long they say the war lasted. So no harm, no foul there. So the 7 years is going to be ending there around 1399. And what Michael Jones and David Falk are saying is that we're saying, or more specifically, the scholars who represent us are saying, like Petrovich and all them, what they're saying is that these letters describe that conquest of Canaan. And then, having built up that straw man, then they're going to say, but these date to like 50 years after that happened, and so it can't be possible, right? And then they're going to bring up other arguments like hot sword and stuff like that. The fact of the matter is, none of the early daters, 0 of them, at least that I am aware of, say that the Amarna letters are describing Joshua's conquests. I don't know of a single one. Now, obviously, in the case of somebody with the new chronology like David Roll, they're going to make the argument that this is talking about something much later. But if you're just talking about those who believe in a standard chronology, Petrovich, as I'm going to show, ABR, as I'm going to show, Scott Stripling, as I'm going to show, they all acknowledge that this took place after the initial conquest and during the period of Judges, which obviously makes this entire objection fall to the wayside. Again, they either don't understand how people are using the Amarna letters, or they themselves are actually manipulating the data in order to try and say, hey, early daters are dishonest. And that's a dishonest tactic. That's a dishonest tactic.
A huge problem. The whole Amarna letter thing is going to be a huge problem for the early daters. Part of the reason why is that the Amarna letters mention the city of Hatzor. And they complain about Hatzor. Okay? Basically, what the letters we get from, say, Levant, is they're complaining to Akhenaten. Okay, so this is not a letter addressed to Amenhotep. This is a letter addressed to Akhenaten, basically complaining that the king of Hatzor is conquering all this land around it, that they've conquered all these kingdoms. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at, say, the lifespan of Joshua, and Joshua is attributed to having destroyed Hatzor. If we assume that Joshua lived 110 years, just assume that for a moment, as the Bible said, that's not an idealized thing. That's an
Let's just assume what the Bible said, as if I thought we were supposed to be Christians here, but no, we're just going to assume what the Bible said because, we over here on the sophisticated side, of course, we know better than to believe what the Bible actually said. And he even let it slip there, right? He's like, let's just assume that's true, as the Bible said. And then he has to go, it's not an idealized number. Which is just your way of getting around the fact that you know exactly what you're saying, which is that the Bible's not true. The ages therein are not true. The chronologies therein are not true. How much of the actual narrative is true? I don't know. I'd be interested to have a conversation about that. Like, do you actually, for example, do you believe the miracle of, I guess IP just made a video of it. I haven't watched it, but, do you believe the miracle of the sun standing in the sky? Curious about that. Did Balaam's donkey talk, for example? Curious about that. Naturalistic explanations for the Exodus, you in, you out? Pretty interested in that. Or naturalistic explanation for the crossing of the Red Sea, be interested in that. I don't know. Maybe they're for that kind of stuff, maybe they're not. At least with some of that stuff, I guess I could probably go check it out because, like I said, IP just made a recent video, but would be an interesting conversation. He's almost done with this particular point, so and they'll have a response here.
Natural literal date. That means that Joshua would have died in 1349,
according to the early date, right?
According to the early date, 1349. This means that Hatzor was conquered in the last 2 years of the conquest. If conquest is defined as the life of Joshua.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, tons of problems here. We're overflowing with problems. First off, nobody defines the conquest as the life of Joshua. Like, literally not a single person. I'm pretty sure Dr. Falk just made that up in the middle of this video, to be honest with you. I would like to find one resource. Certainly not anybody at ABR. That's for certain. Like I said, it's a 7-year period according to most early daters. Some would say a 5-year period. Again, the scripture doesn't explicitly say how long it took, but nonetheless, there is reference to at least 5 years of conflict, and most people believe it took around 7 years. The 5 years of conflicts there's reference to is you have to do a little bit of arithmetic, but basically Caleb's 45. There's 40 years in the wandering and 5 years he spends in Canaan. So that's how you can get at least 5 years of the fight. But nonetheless, nobody defines it as Joshua's whole lifetime. That's the first problem. Second problem, the 1349. I, again, am fairly certain that Dr. Falk just made that number up. I don't know where he's getting that number. If Joshua died in 1349 and lived to be 110, that would mean he was born in 1459, which would mean he was 13 when the Exodus took place in 1446, which would mean he was 13 when he led the army of the Amalekites against the Amalekites, as they came out of Egypt, and only 2 years later would be 15 years old when he's not only counted in a census, which is supposed to be people only over the age of 20, but also when he's sent into the promised land as a spy. So I'm not sure where he's getting that either. That's a relatively minor thing, but I digress. Most people would say, I've heard a lot of people say that he was around 19 in 1446 because he's counted in one census and not the other. That would be 1465. That would mean that he would die in 1355. Other people would say that there are other, times that he would be born. Some people have said if his birth was the first judge, and Paul says the judge's period is about 450 years, and that Paul means it's the period in which judges ruled Israel, which Joshua and Moses would both be considered one. The Bible isn't exactly clear on how old Joshua is. It doesn't address it at all on how old Joshua is when they leave Egypt, in the Exodus. But suffice it to say, he's definitely an adult, and he's definitely of fighting age, because he literally leads the military as soon as they leave Egypt, right? And just 2 years later, he is found to be, going in the promised land as a spy, right? Again, two military things. So I don't know where he's getting the date from either, but that's another thing there. We also have the problem of hot source destruction. But before we have the problem of hot source destruction, I want to go ahead and demonstrate real quickly that this is not what any of the late daters say. None of the late daters say that the Amarna letters are talking about Joshua's attacks on Canaan. Or, none of the early daters. Literally none of them. Let's go ahead and see a couple of the different quotations we have here. Let's go ahead and see. So, actually, we're just going to, because I'll be flipping through a couple different things. We're just going to go to a couple of the ones we have here. So, this is from Dr. Douglas Petrovich. The dating of hot source destruction in Joshua 11, I believe, is the name of the full article. It might just be this section of the paper, but nonetheless, here's a quote that we have from this. Citing Judges 4:24, Wood, that's Dr. Bryant Wood, argues that the Israelites destroyed the Hatzor of this era. Notice of this era, meaning there's Hatzors from other eras, under the leadership of Deborah and Barak. Interesting. However, Hoffmeyer refuses to assign the Israelite destruction to Deborah and Barak, objecting that Wood invented an attack on Hatzor not claimed in the text, Judges 4, which we're going to read. It certainly is claimed there in the text. Hoffmeyer's text, the text is absolutely silent regarding any military action against Hatzor itself, so there is no basis to believe that the destruction of the final LBIIB, which I think is supposed to be late Bronze Age, 12th century, or 13th century, that the LBIIB city was caused by Deborah and Barak's triumph over Jabin and Sisera. Hoffmeyer correctly observes that the text does not expressly state that these Israelites destroyed the city, but his argument from silence cannot prove that Hatzor was not destroyed during the judgments of Deborah and Barak. The biblical author used the verb, sorry, it's hard to read here because it's very small. Let's see here. Man, I can't see that at all. The Hebrew block does not do very well small. It's like super hard to read. But regardless, it's a verb used in Judge 4:24, which features the Hiphil stem implying a complete cutting off. Thus, the demise of Jabin was decisive and final. I cannot read that at all. I think it starts with a hey, but I don't know. Definitely not very good. Anyway, the Israelites went harder and harder against Jabin until they killed him, meaning that they grew stronger and stronger in relation to Hatzor until they were able to defeat its king. Yet could the mere killing of the king who controlled the entire region be seen as a victory that would earn its way into the pages of Judges? Certainly, the Israelite fight was not a personal vendetta against the king himself as a man, but rather against the city of Hatzor and its influence in northern Canaan. In truth, exterminating Hatzor's king alone would be a hollow and meaningless victory for the agents of God's wrath. See Deuteronomy 7:1-2. As mentioned already, archaeology reveals that the very peak of Hatzor's might throughout the entire Canaanite era, was achieved at this time, in which Hatzor's king is the only Canaanite ruler referred to as king in the letters to the Egyptian pharaoh. Considering the Hatzor's exalted status in Canaan from the middle of the 14th century BC through the second third of the 13th century BC, a period of over 100 years, Hatzor represented the most imposing national threat to the Israelites in the Promised Land. So notice Dr. Petrovich, referring to the Amarna period, is saying that this is first off in the period of the Judges after Joshua. He attributes this to this destruction that is being talked about to Judges 4, and there is solid evidence for two separate destructions there, but that's not the point of this video, right? And obviously there you have it. For him, at least, he's not saying this refers to Joshua's conquest. You notice he makes reference here to these letters. Those letters are, of course, the Amarna letters. All right, who's next? This is from ABR. The writer here is Gary Byers. Tyre and the Tel El Amarna tablets. I can English, I promise. Tyre's significance in the 14th century BC can be seen in the Amarna letters. These cuneiform inscribed clay tablets found in Tel El Amarna, Egypt, represent correspondence between minor Canaanite kings ruling under Egyptian auspices during the reign of Egyptian pharaohs oh my goodness, I cannot talk at all today. What's up with this? Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten. Catch this. This is the century immediately following. Congruent with? No. Parallel with? No. Happening at the same time of? No. Contemporary with? No. Immediately following Joshua's initial assault on Canaan, according to biblical chronology. All right, so ABR and Gary Byers, at least Gary Byers, but ABR is publishing this. They don't seem to think that this is referencing the conquest. So that's Doug Petrovich, no. ABR, no. Excuse me. That's not the one I wanted. What else did I want? Maybe this is the one I wanted. Let me see here. No. This is something I wanted for later. I don't know why. Well, this does at least demonstrate this part. The book of Joshua describes 7 years of conquest. This is Aish, which is a Jewish website. The book of Joshua describes the 7 years of conquest and 7 years of settlement in the land of Israel. After the land is conquered, dividing the separate tribal portions via divinely guided lottery. The book of Joshua also describes the biblical boundaries of Israel. So that just gives you a reference here for the fact that Jewish tradition says it took 7 years. But at any rate, so ABR says this is in the Judges period, not the period that they put it in. Doug Petrovich says the same. Here's another thing from ABR. No, that's not it. Here it is. And Dr. Scott Stripling. Let's go ahead and see what they have to say.
All right, now, one of the great discoveries was the Amarna tablets. And I would assume maybe many of our viewers may have heard of this, but if not, why are the Amarna tablets important and where do they fit into this whole conversation?
We have a peasant woman digging for fertilizer in Tel Amarna, Egypt, and instead she starts digging up cuneiform tablets. Don't you hate it when you're digging for fertilizer and you come up with cuneiform tablets?
And the cuneiform tablets
Right, so
are the wedge-shaped letters on clay.
About the shape of my size of my hand. It's clay. It's Akkadian is the language, but the lettering system is cuneiform. So yeah, you get a cuneiform tablets, and so there's 382 of them that are recovered. And these are referred to as the Amarna letters or tablets. It's a series of correspondence between Canaanite city-states and Pharaoh back in Egypt. It dates, very interestingly, to, I would say, about 1370 BC, maybe 1366, or somewhere in that decade, give or take a few years. So my date would be 1370 for the Amarna letters. Now, why does this matter?
Notice, what would his date be for the Amarna letters? Is it 1400? Is it during the Joshua conquest, 1406 to 1399? No, he says 1370. And by the way, for the record, Dr. Falk said that the earliest these could be would be 1389. He's saying roughly 1370, 1366, right? So again, it's just simply not the case. They're just misrepresenting the opposition. Nobody argues that the Amarna letters are demonstrating the conquest found in Joshua. But then there's the other objection, which we kind of already addressed with Dr. Petrich's article there, talking about, well, this is when Hatzor is destroyed, right? Hatzor is destroyed by Joshua during that 7-year conquest. So how is it being destroyed here again? Well, Judges chapter 4 gives us the answer. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. Notice Hatzor is back. Guess who's back? Back again. Hatzor's back with Jabin. Ha ha ha. Very funny, right? Anyways, it's back. We're in the period of the Judges. We're after Joshua's initial conquest. Joshua's dead, and here is Hatzor. It's back. So, obviously, that means that they're going to have to deal with that problem again. And as it turns out, very quickly they have to deal with that problem again because Jabin, king of Canaan, who's, whether that's his name or a title is debated, but nonetheless, he is the one who God delivers them into the hand of, right? Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Hashoreth Hagoyim because he had 900 chariots filled with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. They cried to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have her disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them to the mount of Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands. Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. Certainly I will go with you, said Deborah, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. Excuse me. Now Eber the Canaanite had left the other Kenites. Eber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendant of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Za'an. Oh my goodness. This is going to happen again, isn't it? Za'ananim, near Kadesh. When they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone to the Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned the Harasheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River, all his men, and his 900 chariots filled with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, go this day, the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advice, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. Excuse me. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hatzor, and the family of Heber the Canaanite. Or the Canaanite. Oh my goodness, the Kenite. Doing terrible. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid. So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. I'm thirsty, he said. Please give me some water. She opened a skin of milk, gave him to drink, and covered him up. Oh, not what I wanted there. Stand in the doorway of the tent, he told her. Someone comes by and asks you, is anyone there? Say no. But Jael, Eber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Just then, Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. Come, she said, I will show you the man who you're looking for. So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. Notice, until they destroyed him. So, what's the answer that we have here? How is it that Hatzor is gaining power in these Amarna letters, but it's said that it's going to be destroyed by Joshua? Well, because there is 2 wars against Hatzor, and that end portion there, as you can see, it does say, and they destroyed him. Now, destroyed is not just simply in reference, at least more than likely, to the king of Hatzor in this particular moment, right? It's not just simply referring to Jabin himself. It's referring to Jabin's army, Jabin's nation, Jabin's city, Jabin's royal lineage, right? That's why it uses such an all-encompassing word like destroyed. And so it's a very easy problem for us to solve. So first they put up the straw man. All these guys say that this is evidence for the early date of the Exodus because it's evidencing Joshua's conquest. But we see it actually dates to much later. Then we come, notice it's a straw man, and say, actually, everybody says this is evidence for the early date of the Exodus because there are groups in Canaan that reveal the Hebrews, which I don't even necessarily agree with. Let me remind you guys, I'm not convinced Habiru is actually in reference to the Hebrew. But nonetheless, that's what these people are saying. So at least represent them accurately. But they still date it to the period of the Judges. They all acknowledge it's the period of the Judges. Nobody has the conquest going all the way to 1349. Dr. Falk's just making up the dates. I don't know where he's getting these dates. It's just simply not true. And then the answer to, well, how can Jabin or how can Hatzor be getting power here? Scripture tells you exactly how that is the case. Scripture tells you exactly how that is the case. There is more than one fight against Hatzor. There's more than one destruction of Hatzor. There is an initial one. This one comes from Joshua. There is one that comes later at the hands of Barak. And by the way, that word there, it's probably the same one that Petrovich was trying to show us, to be honest, but I can't read it worth a damn. Probably because I have terrible eyesight, but also because the Hebrew block lettering just really did not look good that small. But nonetheless, the word is hikritu, or at least the word in that word form is hikritu. It comes from karaf. It means to cut down. It means to cut down. So they cut down Jabin, right? And obviously the English translation there is destroyed. So these objections, they're terrible objections. They're terrible objections. They're objections that, and it's funny because in order to accuse all of these early daters of manipulating the data, these people have to manipulate the data. These people have to manipulate what it is that early daters actually say. Early daters do not say that the Amarna letters are actually describing the conquest of Canaan. Early daters do not say that Joshua died in 1349. Early daters do not say that this Hatzor is the same Hatzor as the Hatzor that Joshua takes out. There are 2 Hatzors, same city, but 2 different armies, 2 different groups of people there. Well, maybe not different 2 groups of people. I guess it'd both be Canaanites, but you guys see what I mean, right? Just in the same way that you have like multiple Troys. If you go on to the Anatolian coast there off of Turkey, right? There's a Trojan War era Troy, but there's multiple Troys, multiple cities of Troy, right? But nonetheless, I digress there. It's just simply non-objections. We know why there's another Hatzor here. There's another fight against Hatzor. We know why the Amarna letters are not detailing what appears to be the conquest. That's why nobody believes that. Literally nobody. And again, I even start having a level of agreement with what Falk and IP are saying. If you just look at the spelling in Hebrew of Ivrit versus the spelling of Habiru, it doesn't seem like it works out to me, right? Why couldn't you have stuck to that? No, you got to manipulate the data. Isn't that ironic? So that you can accuse your opponents of manipulating the data. That way you can keep them over there in the corner and just laugh at them. Ha ha, you're so fringe. Well, you can't even represent the arguments correctly. Either that or you just don't know them. Which, honestly, I just find that hard to believe. I find it hard to believe that IP made a documentary about this, that Dr. Falk is a PhD Egyptologist who specializes in this kind of stuff. His channel's called Ancient Egypt in the Bible, right? And he doesn't know what the opposition is saying. I just find that hard to believe. Maybe it's true. Maybe he misinterpreted it. I don't have any idea. But he definitely is not representing it accurately. Mikatank Sali says that's not the only reason why it's not Hebrew. I didn't even say that. So, by the way, I appreciate all of the Jesse Camping, St. Ronan. What's this dude here? Pilgrim something. Appreciate all you guys. You're exactly the kind of guys I want to pioneer mapping, mental approach. Appreciate all you guys tremendously. You're exactly the people I want to talk to. Go ahead and troll away in the live chat because I don't need to convince you. I appreciate you, Sister Cheryl. But I don't need to convince Cheryl. She already agrees with me. If anything, I'm just strengthening the arguments. But y'all going to have these seeds planted whether you want to troll at it or not. And the fact of the matter is, there's nothing defensible here. They manipulate the data. They manipulate what people are saying. They make very poor arguments. They sit there and insult and lambast everybody who disagrees with them. Doesn't matter if they have PhDs or not. It's just the way it is. And now you know. You can't unknow. You can blind yourself to that knowing if you like. It's not my problem. It's your problem. But, you know. Let's go ahead and continue with the video. There we go.
Okay. We know from the biblical text that Hathor was not conquered at the end of the conquest, but at the beginning of the conquest in that first 5 years.
Right. And then it rose up again, see Judges chapter 4. Aren't you also supposed to be like a master's in theology? Like, how do you not know this stuff? I don't know. You know, I mean, I'm just some high school dropout doing YouTube videos in his closet with a Bible, and I know that Judges 4 exists, but you're a PhD Egyptologist and master's in theology, and you don't know it exists. Seems like there might be a problem here as far as how seriously you're taking your time with the text.
Because they conquer Hathor, they destroy Jericho, and then they go and have their council to divide the land.
Mm-hmm.
And then each tribe is responsible for securing their own inheritance. This is very problematic to have Hathor destroyed at the end of it. Now, interestingly enough, the Bible talks about the conquest of Jericho. That it's after, the Bible even notes that Hathor had conquered 5 kingdoms, a bunch of kingdoms, and then had, settled into a peaceful world. And they're coming in after Hathor had made its great expansion. So to have the Amarna letters talk about Hathor expanding,
yeah,
doesn't sit well with the biblical text.
It only doesn't sit well with the biblical text if you don't know the biblical text. By the way, Mental Approach, I do appreciate you. You're always welcome here. I don't think Cheryl will be blocking you. If anything, just because she does respect my rules here. And that's at least my vote of confidence in her. Whether or not that means anything to you, of course, is your own choice. But I appreciate you being here. God bless you. You're always welcome. And all you guys are always welcome, by the way. Obviously, Mecca, you've been here, 4 or 5 times. You can be here 4 or 5 more. You can be here 40 or 50 more. I don't really care. I appreciate you guys being here. So with that being said, though, I just want to point out again, the expansion makes perfect sense if you are going off of what the Bible has to say, right? because we see, just as he's already noted, early in this conquest of Joshua, a Canaan or a Hatzor destruction, right? And then we see in Judges 4 that there is another king of Hatzor who rises up, which means Hatzor has to be expanding at some point, right? And at some point it has to expand so much that it actually has control over at least a good portion of Israel, right? Obviously, what does Judges 4:1 start with? And Hatzor was delivered, or excuse me, and Israel was delivered into Hatzor's hand, king of Jabin's hand, right? So it's a problem for the biblical text if you don't know the biblical text. But if you do know the biblical text, well, no harm, no foul, right? And in a way, it would kind of be like saying, well, so you have let's say you found a history book from America, right? And you didn't really know much, just assume America is an ancient civilization in this hypothetical. You find a history book from America, and you're trying to date this history book, right? And the history book makes reference to the defeat of Germany. And you say, see, this has to be from after the 1950s, because that's when that's when Germany was defeated. It doesn't actually work to put this in the 1920s when this other hypothetical party puts it, because that would be before this defeat took place. And then the camp from the 1920s argument comes up and says Germany was defeated twice by America, actually, right? It's the same kind of argument here. We know Hatzor is destroyed twice, biblically speaking. Once by Joshua, once by Barak. Obviously, Hatzor needs to be expanding if it was destroyed by Joshua and then later had control of most of Canaan with this other Jabin character. Although, again, that could just potentially be a title. I think most people who I'm familiar with do think Jabin is just a title of those kings, not his actual name. But I digress on that. It doesn't even matter. Nobody makes those arguments. As far as the arguments that they actually do have points against. Those are straw men. And as far as the arguments that they don't have points against, it's just a simple understanding of the biblical text. Not something that I should have more knowledge of, definitely. In the case of IP, obviously, he's not a PhD Egyptologist. And to be fair, I don't have nearly the same amount of issues with IP as I do with Dr. Falk. But that's not what this video is about. Continuing forward.
Yeah, and so it seems like early day proponents just sort of like manipulate the data. They'll say
manipulate the data. They manipulate the data, even though in order to try to make a case that they manipulate the data, you had to manipulate the data. Whatever.
Sorry, I kind of rabbit trailed off of your original question here, but let's talk about the Happy.
Okay, yeah, because just real quick, again, as you'll see, they with the dating of the Amarna letters, they sort of manipulate it. They push it much further back to when they actually are dated to the beginning of Amenhotep III, when they should be at the end of Akhenaten. But what about the Habiru and the Amarna letters? Don't they sound like the Hebrew?
Cosmetically, Habiru does sound like Habiru. The one thing we have to understand...
Cosmetically, in English, it does, right? Again, at this point, I would actually start to agree with what Dr. Falk has to say here. In the sense that I've never been convinced that Habiru means Hebrew. And again, my main reason for thinking that has always been the Hebrew spelling of Ivrit, which is the Hebrew word Hebrew, and how it's not hey bet, excuse me, I was going to say hey vav, hey bet, and then a resh, but rather you have the ayin, then you have the bet resh, and then you also have yud and tav, right? And it's Ivrit. It's not Hebrew, right? And so it's like it sounds cosmetically similar, but it sounds cosmetically similar once you get into English, right? Now, obviously, there's a lot of other points that could be made about that word, but just based off of that small fact alone, I've always had serious suspicion, as well as the fact that it is considered to be a social class. I obviously pointed out that sometimes social classes can evolve into ethnonyms, and that's perfectly fine. But just because it can happen doesn't mean it did happen, right? You would have to demonstrate that it did happen. You can't just say, well, it could possibly have happened, therefore it did. It could possibly have been the case that unicorns existed. Well, I guess technically some people do think that that's probably just like a rhinoceros that people mythologize, which could be true. But we'll say that pink unicorns existed. How about that? Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess it's theoretically possible, right? But that doesn't mean it happened. Just because something's possible doesn't mean it happened. But nonetheless, I would likely, agree with that portion there. But it does sound cosmetically similar, I think, in the English. If you're actually comparing, Hebrew to Egyptian here, I think it's significantly less so.
About the word term Habiru is it's a class distinction. It's not an ethnicity. It means outcast, mercenary, bum. Okay, that's what it means. And we find this dating to...
And remember what the argument from people who do think this is Hebrew is that was a phrase that was referring to the Hebrews as first slaves, then wandering tribes people, and then eventually kind of like an invading barbarian group that has a loose tribal confederation for a number of centuries until eventually being united under King Saul and then King David, right? And so the argument goes that these people were referred to as Habiru because they had a lot of Habiru with them, and then eventually that just became a word that referred to their ethnicity. I'm not convinced by it, but that is what the argument is, right? So in other words, people who are on the side of this is in reference to, this is in reference to Hebrew, they still acknowledge what Dr. Falk is saying here. And so I do think it's important for us to note that. By the way, Jamie, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate you, brother. You certainly don't have to apologize for me. But I appreciate that you feel that is something you'd like to do. You have faith enough in my channel that you don't want to stream when I do. Oh, hey, look, Praise is also in this inspiring philosophy live chat. Cool. It's weird when you start to recognize people who are in other live chats. Anyways.
To long before the Hebrews. Terah of Urkesh writes to the king of Mari. He was the former ruler of Urkesh. He's exiled because his own people threw him out. And he writes to the king of Mari and he says, now I have become a Hapiru. He wasn't before an Hapiru. He does become an Hapiru, which means he's a bum. He's a mercenary. He's itinerant. Okay? It's a class distinction. Now, like all class distinctions, some Israelites are Hapiru, some are not. Some Israelites are Amorite, some are not. It becomes sort of almost this vent.
I think you meant some Habiru or Amorites, not some Israelites or Amorites. But notice that Dr. Falk wouldn't actually be addressing what the argument is here, right? And again, I don't agree with what the argument is here. I don't think Habiru and Hebrew are necessarily the same thing. But if you were going to respond to the argument that Habiru and Hebrew are the same thing, it wouldn't make sense for you to say Habiru is a class distinction, not an ethnic distinction, because the other side already acknowledges that. Again, it's similar to usage of the word aborigine or usage of the word native, right? We refer to native to mean the the Native American people. Refer to aborigine typically to refer to the Australian people. First Nations tends to mean Canadian natives, right? In each of these situations, right, you have terms that, especially Native and Aborigine, you have terms that are not originally, meant to reference any of these ethnic groups, but eventually evolve to become those ethnic groups. And that's the argument that's being used for Habiru Hebrew, right? So the response to that would have to take into account the fact that they already agree this was originally a distinction of class and that they're saying it eventually evolved into the word Hebrew, which again, I don't find to be accurate. There is a tradition that the word Hebrew is actually derived from the name Eber, which I don't think the Bible ever explicitly says, but that is actually one of the descendants, one of the ancestors of Abraham, right? You'll find his name in Genesis. And, if that is the case there, then I think that would be, excuse me. I think that would be a, sorry, I just kind of lost my train of thought. I was reading here. So somebody just sent me a text saying when I'm saying Ivrit, that's only in reference to the Hebrew language. It's Ivri when it's referring to the people. So I appreciate that text message there. Always good to make sure we have a correction. Anyways, back to my thought though. So, is that a better etymology or a better origin for the word Hebrew? Who knows? I guess it's not 100% clear, but the point there is that you would still have to address the argument as it is, right? So even when I'm agreeing with Dr. Falk, it doesn't seem like he actually knows what the arguments are in favor of his opposition.
Venn diagram of circles of identity.
Mm-hmm.
So not all Israelites are Hapiru. Some are. The problem with the Hapiru in the Amarna letters is in the wrong place, the wrong time. Okay? Mm-hmm. Here's the key problem with identifying the Hapiru in the Amarna letters with the Israelites is they're too far north.
Right.
The major concentration of Hapiru is in their attack against Byblos. Byblos is in Lebanon. The Israelite conquest never made it up to Lebanon.
Nope.
The furthest north they got was the tribe of Dan.
Now, that's a perfectly fair argument. I would have no objection, I think, to that argument there, because it is perfectly fair. There's no reference in the Bible to the Israelites going that far north. Certainly, it's possible, right? But that's an argument from silence. It's another one of those, like I said, it's possible that they're peak unicorns, right? But it's not what happened. We have to actually demonstrate our points here. So I would actually completely agree in that instance that the Habiru, their place on the map certainly does not jive with what we have in the biblical record, whether that's Joshua, whether that's Judges, right? Whether that's anything else that we actually have in the text.
And they weren't successful. Okay.
So not only it seems like early day proponents cherry pick or try to manipulate the dating of the Amarna letters, they also tend to cherry pick what's actually in them, and they won't tell you about Byblos, but they'll tell you about how Jerusalem is mentioned, or some of the other sites that are mentioned. So it seems like it's a pretty bad argument. But again, you'll see people like Titus Kennedy, Douglas Petrovich throw this around without telling you the details that sort of pull the carpet right from under their argument.
Well, this is sort of the problem is, they're not taking the entirety of the data.
Mm-hmm.
They only take the data out that they like. That's going to be really, really a problem every time you have to make a sober evaluation of the evidence.
Well, let's talk about another piece that Titus Kennedy uses. So he went to Sudan, took pictures of an inscription there on a temple of Amenhotep III. It dates to around 1400 BC, and it says that there were this group called the Shashu of Yahweh dwelling in the desert, and it seems like it could possibly be a reference to the Israel during their wandering period. With the early date, that's kind of when they want to say that Israel was still in the desert getting ready to invade Canaan. Mm-hmm. What's up with the Shashu of Yahweh inscription dating to around 1400 BC? Would that help them arguing that the Israelites were already in the desert at this point.
No, it doesn't help them.
Well, of course, we know that. These are leading questions.
Of course, they're leading questions. Let's not just throw that out there, though. No. Okay, here's why it doesn't help them. First of all, it's not the Shasu of Yahweh, it's the Shasu of Yahoo.
So this is actually another interesting point because it's one where I would basically completely agree. I've never been convinced by the Shasu arguments. The main reason, actually, which I think he is going to reference here later on, is that Yahoo appears to be a toponym, not a reference to a god. It could be a reference to a deity. It's certainly within the realm of possibility. But it does appear to be a toponym, actually, or a reference to a place. They're also in Edom, which, of course, there is not Israelites in Edom. He is going to reference that later on, actually. So in this particular portion, I actually would agree almost entirely with what Dr. Falk says here. Yeah, I don't know. I've never been convinced by the whole Shasu thing. It's another one where, like I said, the spelling is actually different there. The name Yehovah is Yud-He-Vav-He, or as he says, Yahweh, whichever one you think is correct. I don't think it really matters that much, but I do believe on the basis of some stuff from Nehemiah Gordon and others that Yehovah is probably correct. But I digress on that. So it's Yud-He-Vav-He, right? Yehovah or Yahweh, whatever. And then in the case of the Shasu, right, it's actually just Yud-He-Vav. So, you know, what's up with that? Obviously, that seems to be problematic. Also, there is the fact that even given the dating of it, there should be already, you know, so if I remember everything correctly here, the Shasu of Yehovah or Shasu of Yahoo here is supposed to be in around the 1400s to 1300s BC, right? And at that time, you would, according to the according to the early date, have Moses already out of Egypt, and, you know, potentially the Torah is even written. You're into Canaan, all this other kind of stuff, right? The only reason I point that out is because we would expect things like, for example, the spelling of Yehovah to be set already at that point. He's certainly using God's theophoric name. In other words, it's not like it shouldn't be developing or anything like that at this point. It should be pretty solidly established. The Torah has already been given at this point. Joshua's name has already been changed, right, from Hoshea to Yahushua. You know, all this other kind of stuff. So there's other issues to even go in with it too. But the point is just to say, for this next 13 minutes here, until they actually get to the questions, I don't even really have much to say. We can watch it, I guess, if we like, but there's nothing really to respond to because I agree. And we've already been going for like an hour and 45 minutes, so I guess we will stop there. Nonetheless, appreciate you guys. If you liked this channel, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that because of the fact that there were a bunch of people here who appeared to be against me, that this was probably dropped in Dr. Falk's Discord again. So whoever's doing that, I appreciate you. I don't know why you think that goes to your favor if I'm never going to be responded to, but I digress. You're just giving me views. At any rate, I appreciate you guys. If you like this video, please consider liking and sharing this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Let's see what else we have to say. I announced a bunch of stuff earlier. If you guys want to check that out, you certainly can. Hopefully, we're going to be back tomorrow with one of these breakfast teas here. I don't know. I don't really have anything else to say. Seems like an abrupt end, but nonetheless, we see a lot of nonsense that we have here, of course. Mecca, of course, is still in the live chat. I appreciate you. And yeah, if anybody thinks that they have any good responses here, then definitely let me know. Leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, anything like that in the live chat below. Certainly appreciate you. Please consider following us on the different social media platforms which you frequent. I'm on Gab, I'm on Parler, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Minds. Shalom, friends.